there's actually some conceptual blind spots for us to take up the concept of impact investing for the church. So 2 years ago, the blind spot was, is a business good for church ministries, right? I mean, because, it's not hard to imagine a certain degree of skepticism about business as an approach to serve the poor. There's enough evidence why that could be a problem. So 2 years ago, we actually have specific sessions that talk about, is impact investing or the use of a business model aligned with the value of the church and the focus on serving the poor rather than exploiting the poor through a business model? And so we took up that issue, and by the way, there are videos of that conference, and I would say the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace has done a lot of work on the vocation of a business leader, i.e., business can be a force for good. It's not just a force for evil, it could be a force for good. And even the Pope has made it clear, it's not business itself that is inappropriate. In fact, we have heard it from JP2, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis, that business can be used to help the poor rather than to exploit the poor. So we got over that particular conceptual barrier. This session addresses the second barrier that we know of, and that is, does the church do business? Like, well, it may be good. This could be an approach that can work for the poor. Yes, it's not against Catholic social teachings to use business as a model. But really, is that sort of natural to the church? Is that sort of in our DNA, church, business, are these two kind of like complete separate world? So this is an important topic for both sectors, for church people and also for the impact investors, because if the church finds this to be an alien enterprise, then it's not going to go too far. And for church leaders, you have to be convinced that this is not an alien undertaking. So this particular panel addresses the whole question. How is business or commercial enterprise, does it have a role, has it had a role in the history of the church? In the tradition of the church, have we seen sort of the undertaking of commercial enterprises, business enterprises, in the way we serve the poor? So that is the conceptual barrier we want to reach, is church and business enterprises. Have these two sort of had meeting point, or is this actually a weave, in the DNA of the church, even though it may not be very pronounced right now? Addressing this, I'm going to ask only two questions, starting with the question is, what in your, from your perspective, has been the role of commercial enterprise in the work and the ministry of the church? And our three panelists, Cardinal Turkson, who is actually extremely entrepreneurial. I have to tell this little story that when I went to visit him with Sean, January of 2013, I was proposing this idea of impact investing and how we should really convene a conference at the Vatican. He looked at me and he said, Carolyn, 20 years ago when I was a new bishop, I approached CRS and said, how about if I put in some money and you put in some money and we create a fund that could support church enterprises? And CRS said, no. So I said, I'm sorry, Your Eminence, we're 20 years too late. We are now here to make amends, all right? But so Cardinal Turkson, and then I'm going to turn to Mark Steed and also Professor Bruni. I'm not going to make any more introductions because each one who is here, attendee and speaker, each one of you really has amazing background. And the bios are in your packet, so just please do read up on your own, but recognize that each of these people is here for a reason. And when two people come together, there is a multiplication effect. So I'm going to sit down with the first question. What has been the role of enterprise, commercial and business enterprise in the work of the church, starting with Cardinal Turkson? Do we have a second microphone here? Okay, oh, good. So you have that microphone between the two of you, and we have this microphone between the two of us. Take it away. That's an American expression, says. Please start.
Well, okay. So,
is it working?
hello.
All right, use this one.
Hello? Well, okay, so now the church and enterprise, right?
Yes.
Now, the first thing I want to say is that if anybody in fact wants any very detailed treatment of this, one could consult the compendium of the social teaching of the church, where the subject matter has been treated in some detail. In some detail, the paragraphs and the chapters I'll probably not be able to offer to you now. But I suppose the consideration of the church and business in the church or any entrepreneurial spirit and all of that, I think they probably should be related and rooted in the very basic account of the beginnings that we have in the book of Genesis. The task that God gave to man, the human being at creation, was to till and to keep, from which we've developed subsequently the theory about stewardship and man being given a stewardship of creation and the care of it. Now, to keep and to till, it's interesting. I mean, I don't think tonight I want to do biblical studies here, but the word to keep, shomer, is the same word that is used when Cain kills his brother Abel. And when God comes to him and says, "Where is your brother?" Cain responds, "Am I my brother's keeper?" So we take that sense of, am I my brother's? Am I responsible for him? Am I supposed to? We take that sense and bring it to that thing about keeping and tilling, the earth and everything that God. So it just means that it's not just locking the earth up in the wardrobe of something, but it's like actively engaging with the creation so that creation satisfies the concrete needs of the human person. And this cannot be done without a certain amount of a transformation of the very many raw materials or the very many things that creation had. So the keeping and the tilling of the earth involves man or the human person in a very crucial activity of business, if you want. Business in the sense of transforming the very many, if you want, elements of creation for the concrete and specific needs of the human person. And so here, all of us seated around the tables with bottles and everything. If you were to take the bottle, God created a sand crystal. He didn't create a bottle. Human industry had to convert sand into bottle for the water and the wine and everything that you have. The chairs you're sitting on, God created wood. God did not create furniture. It is human industry and human enterprise that converts wood into furniture. So in that sense, business is very much a part of the vocation of the human person. The vocation to keep and to till the land is a vocation that also engages and invites the human person to be businesslike, to be entrepreneurial, and to get into this work of transforming what God has created for his own need. That's also how we refer to the human person as a co-creator. Co-creator with God, because God's work is still ongoing and the human engagement with creation corresponds to this. And this, therefore, would also be the basis of our appeal to ethical considerations in this. Because the human person is a co-creator, everything that he does then has to be with reference to the will of God, the one who entrusted this to him. And so very many other consequences that we can draw to it. But I suppose basically and essentially, to respond to the question, the charge of God to the human person at creation makes the human entrusts a vocation to the human person, the realization of which requires that the human person becomes entrepreneurial, exercise business, and also does a little bit of enterprise, making what God has created respond to the concrete and specific needs of the human person.
Thank you. Let's pass it to Mark Steve.
Thank you. The notion of enterprise as organized transformation strikes me as exactly right. The notion of enterprise as organized transformation strikes me exactly right. And the history of the church for centuries has been doing that type of organized transformation at scale. right now, the church is the largest provider of health care in the world. The 1 in 6 hospital beds in the U.S. are in Catholic institutions. Not only is this transformation taking place at scale, it's taking place often very well. 25 of the 100 top hospitals in America are Catholic. The Catholic education has been in my country since the 1600s, and it's been sort of consistently entrepreneurial and innovative. The Sisters of Ursuline were charging in the 1700s, were charging the wealthy of New Orleans high tuition so as to cross-subsidize free education for the poor. The scale was always impressive. 500,000 people by 500,000 kids by 1884 in the U.S. were getting Catholic education. Here in Europe, of course, things go much further back. Hospitals, orphanages, schools, even micro-lending of a sort in the 1500s, I learned, all Catholic enterprises, often led by women. We're here in the middle of a Jubilee year. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be here in the Jubilee year. There was a tragedy in the 4th Jubilee year in 1450. The Eternal City, Rome, really wasn't looking all that eternal. It had kind of fallen into pretty severe disrepair. Only 2 bridges were left over the Tiber. There were only thousands of people lived here, and pilgrims would come to Rome to visit St. Peter's, but they'd stay on the other side at Piazza Navona. They were all leaving one day in December, and a mule stopped on the one bridge, and a panic ensued, and 100 souls lost their lives. The Pope at the time knew there would be another Holy Year 25 years after that, and so he set about building a bridge. Now you start thinking about what all that involves, and what you've got is public infrastructure being built to support an emerging activity that's revitalizing a city, that's building a community, that's creating an opportunity for all sorts of human interactions. Seems to me like that's an impact investment. And so when we start thinking about impact investing in the church, I'm reminded of, and I hope this is appropriate, but a kind of funny story out of Molière. Molière wrote at one point a play about an ordinary guy who inherited some money and wanted to become fancy. He wanted to become a bourgeois gentleman. So he hired a bunch of people to teach him how to be proper. And at one point he announced with great delight that he just learned that he had for his entire life been speaking prose. It seems to me that the church has been speaking impact investing for a long, long while, and the notion of having clear and good organized insight into how to manage things. Now, lots of times this gets disguised because people think about hierarchies and the organization of the church as opposed to markets. But as we'll learn, as economics teaches us, that markets and hierarchies are 2 different ways of accomplishing the same thing. But in both cases, what you've got to do is organize how things get done. And that seems to me to be something that the church has been doing, and we shouldn't draw a false separation between the church's large-scale organized activity, which often generated, the sisters who were building the hospitals had to figure out how to pay for them. The orphanages had to run. The schools were large-scale enterprises. We shouldn't overestimate the difference between those enterprises and regular businesses. And so social impact investing and social enterprise is less new to the church than we might otherwise imagine. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. We turn to Professor Bruni.
They are very short, very quick in their intervention. Thank you very much for the invitation. Sorry for my English that is very mafia movies accent. Sorry for that, but probably you during these days living in Rome you will become more familiar with his accent in Italy. Volume. Okay. I think that from the historical point of view, because they Mrs. Flaminia and Cardinal Taxon, they knew me before. They invited me probably because I'm quite an historian of economic ideas. And from the historical point of view, the relationship between money, finance, and church is quite complex. A sort of ambivalence in that. It's not easy in the gospel in particular, but not just in the gospel. Even in the book of Genesis, the first time that we find the word profit in the Bible, in the Genesis, is for the sale of Joseph from his brothers. The first time we find the word contract is when Abraham buys the tomb for Sarah. Then is a complex story. It's not easy. If you no need to mention the relationship between Jesus and the market and the merchants, Jesus and money. The gospel is full of economy. Sure, Jesus was a really expert in the economic affairs because he's full of examples of languages about the economic life, but at the same time it's not easy. Then I'm very happy that today many companies are very much interested in financing, in being involved with supporting financially, economically the church. Just few words. First, I think we invented as Christians the spirit of capitalism. Not just the Protestant spirit of capitalism, Max Weber, but also in the Catholic spirit of capitalism much before the Reformation. The first banks were invented by Franciscans in the Middle Age, in the late Middle Age, Monti di Pietà, the first popular banks. And Ora et Labora of St. Benedict was actually the road to market spirit of capitalism, because they put together work and intellectual activity, because before St. Benedict the work was just for slaves. And then without this reconciliation between the ethics of work and the spirit of Europe, no market economy was possible at all. Then there is a huge contribution of Christianity to capitalism. Then I'm just coming from Asia. I was first in South Korea, then to Philippines. And when as you know, South Korea has about 40 million people, and is 12 in the ranking of GDP. Philippines, 80 million of people, 115 in the GDP. There are many differences in that. There are differences in institution, differences in education, a lot of stuff. But the main difference is the ethics of work. Then without an ethics of work, it's very difficult to imagine any business, any company, because entrepreneurs, before everything, they are workers. Then I think the first contribution of companies in development, in working with church, is to help people in developed country to develop and foster an ethics of work, because without ethics of work it's very difficult to imagine any kind of sustainable company and business. Then, if I have other 3 minutes, can I have under 3 minutes? Yes. 3, yes. How is possible to work together for a profit organization and the church? Because the church is quite an unusual and strange animal, because of course has economic dimensions, has budget constraint, has of course economic issues, but is not an NGO, as Pope Francis said recently, but is not a for-profit organization, as you know, because the mission is much more complex than maximize profit. Then when we put together church and company, there are some I would say methodological issues. I think how to work together. First, I think the very important principle, according to me, in my humble opinion, is subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is a beautiful principle in the Catholic social thinking, because subsidiarity means that money, finance are good if foster the relationship in community. If instead money, contract, and finance substitute the relationships in community, and the cash nexus becomes the only nexus in community, of course, is bad. Then subsidiarity is very important. And more at point, subsidiarity, according to me, means, in the Catholic social thinking, that the first competence for exiting, for leaving poverty condition is the competence of the poor. The first competence is the competence of the poor. If we don't discover this competence and we just substitute, we jump the competence of the poor, helping from outside the poor, there is not success, because we must start from the competence of the people living within the problem. That was the message of Pope Francis in Nairobi. When he went to the slums of Nairobi, he said, you have your competence. We must discover the competence, for instance, living in hardship is a huge competence to be able to do that. Then subsidiarity means in helping people, we must start from their competence, and just at the second moment, we can help them. That means respect, dignity, that we have to discover the reason for respecting poor people. Then also, but there are also some recommendations for the church, if I can say. First recommendation from an economist, because I'm professor of economics. First recommendation, don't forget the most fragile and most vulnerable people that are not rentable at all. There is not financial return from the very fragile. Then church, don't forget the poorest among the poor. Second, mission shift. We know when money comes, the risk of mission shift is always there. The means become the end. We know there are huge evidence in the last century, even in the Catholic Church. Then we start an hospital for supporting the mission, and then the hospital becomes the goal of the mission. All energy becomes to supporting the hospital, and we forget the reason for that hospital that was spreading the gospel. Third, advocacy also towards the state. Governments, because of course we need money for profit organization. It's a beautiful enterprise, but we also need advocacy for asking more to state, to government. Business is not enough for fighting severe poverty problem. To conclude, I think we need a sort of CSR in corporate social responsibility 2.0. Then we know that in the CSR 1.0, the ethics was the constraint and the goal was profit maximization. I think now we need a sort of shift towards ethics and social impact is not just a constraint, but is the goal of economic activity. It's part of intentional goal, because if we look in the long run, inclusion, social community inclusion is part of our goal, and it's not just a constraint. Finally, we know that the difference between the DNA of chimpanzee and human beings is about 2%, because we share 98% of the DNA with the chimpanzee. This is quite well known. Then the difference between a standard company and a church company maybe is about 2%, because 98% they're very close, because they are budget constrained, they are mission, vision, of course, accountability, clients, customers, so. But please, don't forget the 2%, because if we forget the 2%, we treat chimpanzee as human beings. This is not good for the chimpanzee, of course, not for the human beings. But okay, we must look at 98%. This is very good, because sometimes we fail for the lack of a very standard, very common sense management culture. But also we can fail forgetting the 2%, because we can become very similar to any kind of company business. Then if we lose the 2%, then I think it's a very good news, this collaboration between for-profit organizations and the church with these methodological recommendations that I just would like to put forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Buni. Let me and to all the other panelists too. So I'm going to ask my next question, and I think we'll have a little bit of time left, and Beth, you'll be my timekeeper for the audience, so hold your questions. So Professor Buni actually raised three very important points. One is that, by the way, I forgot to say, this conference is actually not about impact investing. It's about what we can do for the poor, which is the second part of this title, Vatican Impact Investing in a Year of Mercy, impact for the poor. So thank you for that reminder, and for the reminder that building the competence of the poor is really what we're about. And in fact, the church invested in a lot of education about that. So the first thing is really the focus on the competence of the poor. The second issue you raise is about mission shift, which is, I think, well reflected in your anecdote about the 98% similarity and the 2% difference. The third part is you're reminding us also, too, about the role of the government, that we need to push for that. So I'm just going to pass it back to our two panelists over here, and for you to take up any of these particular points, or whether there are additional points in response. Cardinal Turkson and Mark, whoever wants to go first.
I strongly agree with both those points. Though mission shift, I would like to also suggest that I studied at one point the history of charitable giving by corporations. It was illegal before World War I. The corporation, the view of the corporation, the modern corporation, was you could only do exactly what you said you would do, and the only thing that was allowed was maximizing profits. The YMCAs could build, they won a court case allowing them to build, pay the YMCA to build housing for the workers, but they lost the case when they wanted music festivals. That was just too far out. The corporation evolved, and the corporation evolved around World War I and World War II. Crisis changed what people thought was acceptable. And in a time of crisis, people started saying, oh, we got to start taking this seriously. Corporations have a much larger capacity to make a difference, and we should let that happen. That might have been CSR 0.0. You know, that was the beta CSR. And my point is that all of these, or I'm for worrying about mission shift, but I'm also for trying to help all the organizations in society shift over time to taking broader ethical concerns into play. And that I very much agreed with Dr. Bruni on. And I think that there's a real possibility to make progress on that. Because in the 1990s, I worked with a hippie business called The Body Shop. We were laughed at, but now a lot of those views are taken seriously. Let's think 20 years from now and what we can build out of this conference and out of more activity around it that once again shifts and broadens the horizon of of organized human activity.
Whatever you want to say or not want to say.
I think I agree also with Professor Bruni's observation analysis of the poor and all. The issue of poverty and any initiative in society to help the poor is always kind of a tricky one. Although religion or Christian or biblical religion is always found and fashioned for itself the duty and the responsibility to deal with it. In the Old Testament, it becomes one of the legislations. Helping the poor was a subject matter of legislation. In the book of Leviticus, if people reap their field, they were not supposed to reap to the extremities. They were supposed to leave whatever was there for the poor ones to glean on there. It's as if to recognize that there would always be elements in the society who are poor, either because they are migrants, either because for whatever reason. A similar thing comes with the institution of the Jubilee. The Jubilee Year institution is also underpinned by the fact that it's like the Jubilee Institute becomes a new way of granting a new lease on life. If people began life and began business and got into trouble or got poor from it, in 50 years, they were not supposed. This wasn't supposed to be perpetual. 50 years, the Jubilee comes, and people can start all over again. There's a new lease on life, as it were. So we do have legislations in scriptures about poor ones in society, as if there was an attempt to if you want, poverty alleviation was almost, if you want, a concern of biblical scripture. The book of Deuteronomy will tell us that the aim of the Jubilee year is that there be no poor one found in your midst. as it were, so legislation to ensure that there was no poor one, okay, in the midst of the people of Israel. So with all of these legislations, we do have also, the financial part of it. And again, in the book of Leviticus in the Bible, when people lend out money, they were not supposed to charge interest. That was Israel at that point. And so once, for example, there was a seminar organized at the Angelicum, Islamic and Christian, financial thinking. And then, one Islamic scholar who came from Indonesia argued that originally Christian or biblical idea about finance was the same as Islamic. There was no interest, there was nothing until in the Middle Ages when Thomas Aquinas began theologizing. Then he began to make a case. If you lend money to somebody and somebody is able to do business with the money and get some profit, then in justice, he should share the profit with the person who lent the money. And from that, gradually, charging interest developed or began to grow. But originally, as it were, when you lend money, you don't charge any profit at all. So a lot of things have developed, in the history of all of this relationship. But the point I put about subsidiarity, as basically expressing two terms. Subsidiarity expresses participation and responsibility. And when this is applied to finance or the type of issues that we've been talking about and we'll be talking about the next 2 days, it is to grant the poor space in participating in the process of lifting them out of poverty. They need to be part of this. At one of the TICAD meetings, TICAD is the Tokyo International Development for Africa, they hold a meeting every year. In one of these meetings, which was held in Nairobi, again we're going to Germany, the then Minister for Foreign Relations, Dr. Ushiaid, I think he's still around, a doctor, German, and said that the only development projects that would work are development projects prepared by Africans, in this case, themselves, and adopted or supported by their partners. So it is not, therefore the approach to alleviating poverty or fighting poverty is not the adaptation and implementation of solutions from outside. Has to be, has to be prepared from the base. Incidentally, Pope Benedict XVI, in Caritas in Veritate, makes the same point. And when he traveled to Angola, to grant, to present the findings of the Second Synod for Africa, he reminds the African leaders who had gathered in Angola about the same thing. They're the only measures, the only initiatives against poverty that would work are those which are worked from below by the people themselves, and this is to enable them to exercise responsibility for the project and to ensure that the project also works. So in this sense, subsidiarity expresses that, right? It fashions, it kind of formulates the two things which are crucial for all of this: participation, responsibility. And that means that you give a lot of responsibility to the poor if even the project is to help lift them out of poverty. So they should become, if you want, the artifacts of their own solution. This for me is a very happy discussion, because in 2010, just arriving here in Rome, first assignment we got was to represent, lead a Vatican delegation to the UN, and was to talk about the MDGs. And the point was about poverty and all. And the point we found ourselves making was that let us not fight the poor, let us fight poverty. And we do not eliminate poverty by eliminating the poor. We eliminate poverty by investing in the resourcefulness of the poor and not eliminating the poor. So there can be so very many other ways of also dealing with the type of thing which is inspired, the impact investment and everything we'll be talking about these next few days. So subsidiarity does express it. Make for participation of the poor and those you want to help, And then that way also make them very responsible for everything that they will be part of formulating. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to say a few things. Number one is many of you probably do not know the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace has been operating in this middle space between the church and corporations by bringing, I mentioned the vocation of the business leader from a religious perspective to say it is possible to be a business leader but also to live the gospel, and this is how. This is a document, and you could go online or you can get a copy. And Cardinal Turkson and Michael Cherney invested a lot of time and conversation with different groups to bring this about, and is now going out into different areas of the world. So for those of you interested, please do go on the website and download the vocation of a business leader. At the same time, they have brought together industry leaders from the mining industry. In fact, we have someone from the mining industry here, from the pharmaceuticals. And look, they would never become quote-unquote church organizations, but convening them in some ways is implicit. It implies that there is ways that corporations in these sectors, very difficult sectors, can work in a way that allows the quality of life, the justice issue of the poor, and so on, to be addressed. That it would never be perfect, but that conversation is not unproductive. If that is the case, why convene it? So I just want to say, I want to acknowledge the Pontifical Council's role in bringing together these difficult sectors to talk about, in the end, what is good for people whose lives are affected by these enterprises, recognizing that sometimes without mining, some of these communities do not have jobs also. So having said that, I'm going to have my own little response to Professor Bruni, because I was once a professor, and you can't bait a professor and just let it go, all right? Okay, laugh. Okay, good. Yes, indeed, it is true that there's the 2% between humans and chimpanzees. But a lot of times I think but people in the nonprofit sector and people in the church in particular actually fail to recognize that there is 98% similarities. The 2% difference have caused us to completely not talk to each other. You will be amazed that sometimes I go to different countries and I visit with the cardinal, the highest level bishops and that, and I said, and they tell me all their problems, how the poor are not treated right, and there are these issues, and so on, and employment is an issue. And I asked the next question: have you ever talked with the Society of Commerce? What are they called? The Chamber of Commerce. Yep. I said, do you ever get together regularly with the Chamber of Commerce? Because there's no way to generate jobs if you don't engage corporations. And they look at me like I have two horns, like we and the Chamber of Commerce. And I actually go further and I say, church leaders, particularly the bishops, the cardinals, nuncios, and so on, are extremely well educated. They could speak multiple languages. Just ask Cardinal Turkson how many languages he can handle. English and French and whatever, Italian and whatever. And I said, you all have graduate degrees. You're extremely well educated and intellectually, well equipped to have these conversations with sort of like these people also have graduate degrees, mostly in business. But in terms of sort of the intellectual pound for pound exchange, there is there. And I said, you understand the problems. They may hold the key to the solutions, and in the end, they have a stake in the problems to be solved. And I could kind of report, I don't think I have any success with, and they probably wouldn't tell me if there is. But this whole idea of, therefore, because of that 2% and a history, there is a history of bad deeds in corporations. The church is not perfect. We have to say that too. Because of that 2% difference, it has caused us to completely sort of shy away from the 98% possibilities. The other thing I want to say is that even with CRS, I will give you a very, very profound and simple insight. First of all, the insight is driven by a need. The need is that in the programs that we do, our initiatives, we have big initiatives in agriculture, in water, and so on. Nowadays, as we receive funding, there is this question: how can you be sure that the benefits you generated can be sustained after you are gone and after the program has ended? What have you done to not only build up the capacity of the poor, but create an infrastructure that the poor can engage its local markets and become better? Because one day you will be gone. One day the grant funding will end. And it's good for CRS to be gone. In the end, we are guests. We have to build up the capacity. So now this question is very prevalent. How do you make sure that the good that you do, whatever benefits you created and how you have lifted up the poor, that the whole thing doesn't just fall apart when the grant funding is over? It's one of the most legitimate questions as of not-for-profits. So how many, magic bullets do we have but to engage the people we serve, the poor, in a way that they could participate in the local markets, in a way where they have some clout? So that's the pressure driving this particular profound, simple insight. And that is, if we look at CRS, we have worked with local partners extensively in our 73-year history. Today, we work with 1,200 partner organizations, the local organizations. And I asked them, are they mostly not-for-profit? The answer is almost all non-profit. I said, what do you have against working with for-profit enterprises as our partners? What do you have against them? And I said, of course, a lot of businesses are not all perfect, right? But neither is our nonprofit partners. We have to screen them carefully. We have to look at each one and say, will they keep their commitments? Are they really, really dedicated to the poor? Do they have good operating models, or do they fall apart? Have we built their capacity? So I'm not advocating so much business, but I want to point out, and it's good that Professor Bruni mentioned this possible mission shift, and to not forget that 2%. And I think we play a role in terms of holding that line. I also have to address the question, which is, the gospel tells us you cannot serve two masters, right? You cannot serve money and God at the same time. And that's a difficult teaching, because all of us hold back some of our money, I have to say, But I also have to ask the question, but approaching the proper use of financial capital doesn't mean necessarily that we'll be serving mammon. And so what holds that line for each of us in this, both our church leaders here, as well as the people who are in impact investing sector, because you want to have that authenticity in supporting impact. So I'm going to end now. Beth said I have 5 minutes, and I'm going to have each of the speakers speak for 1 minute. Okay, let's start with you. 1 minute, okay?
But my English is lower than yours. Then I have 1 minute and a half. No, sorry. And no, thank you. I agree what you said. I think 10 years ago, when I was also involved in the team for helping for the draft of Caritas in Veritate, I was quite concerned. I was a sort of enemy of the idea of profit. Profit was considered to be the problem. Now I think the real disease of our capitalism is not for-profit organization, but for rent organization. Rent-seeking is the disease. Then the condemnation of usury in the Bible, seen from an economics point of view, is a condemnation of rent-seeking, because there were power structure using their position for exploiting poor, because money is always power. And then there was a condemnation of rent-seeking, not profit, because profit is a flow. You must work for creating every year profit. Rent is something I get today for what I did yesterday. And then the for-rent organization are the enemy of our system, not the for-profit organization. For profit is something I really like. Of course, it depends on the process of profit creation, and depends on the destination of profit. I'm chairing the project of the economy of communion. Then I know that the profit has a sort of social nature, must go to the poor. But I think there is nothing wrong with the corporation. I really think corporation are essential for the common good. There is no common good today without corporations. It's a sort of utopia to imagine a world without entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are sort of common goods because they are problem solver, much more the profit maker. They are people able to solve problem, to see before the anticipation. The definition of Gibbons of the entrepreneur is the one who anticipates. Then I think I think the rent seeking is the disease, not the for profit. Because profit is good, of course, the destination is important, but there is nothing bad over making profit, according to me.
Thank you.
Just briefly touching on this thing about the discomfort, let me put it this way, that church or church leaders may have with regard to business, to the point that they will probably not be able to touch with the longest pole that you have. Some of that I think is from a lot of experience in mission territories, having leading a church funded by missionaries from outside, who dispose of whatever finances that a local bishop or a local caretaker who takes over the same project does not dispose of. He always becomes very careful about what he can get into. But I think the biggest difficulty, which I've also mentioned and which I hope is going to be the next step in this whole exercise, is training local personnel. The preparation of local expertise or local personnel to handle all of this industry is very crucial. And I think in the several places where you talk with bishops and all, and their reluctance and all, if they had competent priests or personnel, lay whatever trained in accounting, in business studies, management, and all of that, I think their own courage with regard to finance and entering into business, entrepreneurial space would completely change. Not knowing so much about that industry, but knowing so much about the dangers that may, is such that a lot of people are basically, if you want, petrified, as it were, in their relationship towards this. You know what dangers can accrue from this, but you have very little knowledge about how to deal with whatever is capable of causing the danger, and so your thing is not to touch it. So I think one of the things that probably should follow this campaign and is just that we have people who are given some kind of training, ideas, knowledge about how money works, accounting, business management, the investment market and all of that. With a little bit of knowledge of that, and as knowledge about this spreads on the local church level, if every diocese would dispose of one or two financial experts, all of this I think would change, and the courage that local churches and local figures would have, getting entrepreneur and getting on this would change. So I think your meeting you had with the bishops and all of them not being comfortable with this, I think is something that is bound to be a thing of the past, as more and more we get people knowledgeable about this industry.
I agree. A big plus one, as the young people say, on both those comments. I would only say that right now is a very frightening time around much of the world. We've got, between the financial crisis and the repercussions of it for years, we now have Brexit, we now have the immigration crisis. There is a lot of concern. One thing history tells us is that times like that are the times you can make progress. Times like that are when people look up and think about how to do things differently. The Pope beautifully talks about a poetry of social action, right? That's what we're here to write, and I'm pleased to be a small part of it.
Wonderful. Please give them all a big hand.